What is it that makes you free? For all the disagreements that typify our day and age, this is quite a large question that actually seems to draw a fairly large consensus. Freedom, we suppose, is simply the ability to do what we want. It's the abilities to engage in the activities that we want without let or hindrance. And so, if we lived in an ideal world, we'd all be able to do exactly what we wanted. Go hiking in the mountains one day, spend the next eating cheese and wine, and then the next after that learning piano. Simply anything that comes to mind, whatever our velleity draws us to. Without the impositions of an overbearing parent or a government, or indeed simply the basic necessities of life, we would be free to do what we want and live as we please. And so that is the general conception of freedom in the modern age. Under this conception, freedom is like being a wedding guest standing before a big buffet. The more food that's available to you, the more plates that are stacked on the table, the freer you are, because you have a greater ambit of choice. And conversely, the fewer plates that are available to you, the more limited the selection, the less free you are. Therefore, the ultimate aim of the, should we say, libertarian modern model of freedom is to have really an infinite array of choices available for the subject. To have as many foods as you could ever ask for there at the buffet, an infinitely long table full of every food imaginable, so that your choice is not restricted by necessity. The key phrase is anything you want. Anything you want becomes available to you, and to the extent that you can fulfill that sort of motto, you are free, or even fully free. What I want to gently introduce to you is the possibility of reconsidering this conception of freedom, or more specifically proposing an alternative understanding of freedom so as to transform the way that you think about the concept. My main intellectual guide here is David Bentley Hart, who's written and spoken on this subject in a way that naturally is far more sophisticated and articulate than myself, so I will link a particularly good video in the description, which I highly recommend you watch after this. The first thing that we should do is reflect on what this wedding buffet analogy tells us. If the expansion of freedom is nothing more than the incremental acquisition of ever more options for the chooser, you might notice that there's actually no movement being made to cross what is ultimately a categorical divide between the chooser, the person sitting there with an empty plate, and the buffet, the food itself. You are giving yourself more options, even an infinite number of options, but you are not giving yourself any direction as to which option is the best to choose. The table is widening and more plates are being stacked onto it, but you're not getting any closer to the table. But that, of course, is only in the abstract. What's more realistic is you are getting very close to the table, but you're doing so in a way that has no direction whatsoever. You just gorge yourself on whatever dish seems to be nearest to you or most appealing as you immediately see it. And as such, you're putting together all kinds of foods that are either unhealthy for you and so bad for your body, or they don't go well together, their taste is horrible, or you're eating too quickly and giving yourself indigestion. All these different things which come from just the unfettered libertarian freedom that you believe is what makes you ultimately emancipated. Again, whatever occurs to your velleity, whatever simply proves itself to be appealing in that moment, you take freedom to be the ability to just do what you want there. And so whenever you see chocolate cake, or you see pasta, or you see rice, or you see anything in between, you just go, because it just makes you feel good. And so your freedom is the extent to which you can just make yourself feel good in the immediate, really, moment or instant of your choice. If we can take this wedding buffet analogy to be an image for modern libertarian freedom, then we can take the very famous image from antiquity of Plato's cave to be an analogy for an alternative classical conception of freedom. This is the alternative that I would like you to take into consideration. Under this model, if we do the same thing that we try to do with the wedding buffet, which is just expand the size of the table, here all we're really doing is expanding the size of the cave for the people in the dark. All you're doing is giving those people who are stuck down there, who are trapped and distracted by illusions, more space to wander around aimlessly. You're giving them even an infinite number of directions that they could go in that cave, but all of those directions are covered in darkness. And so all you can do is simply follow wherever your body immediately takes you, just wherever you think is the next place you want to go. Crucially, even with an infinite expansion of the possibility of direction, these people are no closer to being free from being trapped in the cave. In fact, quite the opposite. You are increasing the possibility of these people getting even more lost and even more stuck because you're giving them a whole host of directions and opportunities to move with no direction out, with no direction toward the light. So, for Plato and Augustine and plenty of other people who, in various religious traditions or non-religious traditions, were influenced by Plato, freedom was not about your ability to just do what you want. Freedom was not about the ability to just choose. Rather, it was about the ability to choose well. And to the extent that you could choose well, you became freer. If you're stuck in the cave and you're moving this way and that way, not knowing where you're going, it doesn't matter how far you go, how many directions you take. Whether you are in darkness with just a small bit of movement, a small bit of standing still, or you're in darkness having fumbled about everywhere, having exercised all of the space that's in the cave, you're still in darkness, in both cases. So David Bentley Hart's conclusion is that our modern conception of freedom is one that ultimately is nihilistic. It is just a consumerist ethic which looks to expand the ambit of the market to an infinite degree without giving us any sort of normative or teleological direction as to what are the right choices to make. It is obsessed with giving us a heightened ability to choose and completely neglects teaching us how to choose well. If this all sounds a bit foreign to you, I'd note that this is already the scheme that we apply to our thinking and treatment of addiction. If you do suffer from an addiction and you're trying to free yourself from that addiction, your freedom clearly doesn't come in just having the choice to either drink alcohol or not drink alcohol, if that's your particular addiction. Rather, your freedom comes in your ability to say no to alcohol, an ability which, when you're under the influence of addiction, is very much diminished. Rather, your freedom comes to the extent that you're able to lift yourself up and away from what you'd normally just impulsively choose, in the same way that the wedding guest would just impulsively take the first food that he saw on the table and then the next one and then the next one, without any sense of direction or teleology or an inclination as to what might be good for him. When you do rehab, you're not trying to cultivate a kind of consumerist indifference to whether or not you drink alcohol. You're striving for a particular end. I keep using the word teleological because this is really the central feature here, is there's a teleology behind your choices. There's a purpose to them. There's a rationality involved, which says it's not just about being able to choose whatever I want, it's about being able to choose the right thing. Because in choosing the right thing, my freedom expands. It's very difficult at the start of rehab to get yourself out of the habits of just drinking impulsively. And so there are moments where you're going to have to really work hard to say no, even when you're very tempted to. But then, as everyone attests, from actual people who have suffered with addiction to the psychologists who study it, the better you get at saying no, and the more frequently you say no, the easier it becomes. Quite contrary to this modern conception of freedom, instead of widening the ambit of your choice, you are narrowing, you're focusing in on a good choice, on what's right for you. In this case, freeing yourself from addiction, saying no to your impulsive desire, because you know that there is something that is better for you. You know that there is, to use the Platonic language, a good above all the particular objects in which that good either manifests or does not. As such, there's quite a fascinating paradox which seems to arise, at least from the perspective of modernity. For Plato and for Augustine, as you exit the cave, the light grows. And so, the more you climb through the cave, the more clearly the light reveals itself to you, the easier it becomes to follow. At the bottom, in complete darkness, you are completely lost. And sometimes you'll have to stumble about in a way that you just don't know where you're going. But the moment you catch a glimmer of the light and you start to follow it, and you focus really hard on finding it, is the moment you see it grow. And then it goes larger and larger and larger until it's just so obvious to you, should we say you exit the cave, that there's nothing but light. And so you can't even entertain the possibility of going back into the darkness. It's just lost its appeal. You have no interest in wandering about doing those pointless things that you found so appealing before, moving in directions that you thought were useful to you and good for you before. In the same way, people who are freed from addictions, when you're completely healed, you look on the stuff and you go, why would I ever have found that appealing? Why did I ever turn to alcohol at this moment, or turn to drugs at this point? They just become empty. You see with clarity the light, and so there's no appeal anymore in any of the darkness. You see, that is, illusions for what they are, and you saw yourself as deluded by thinking that they had a real appeal and a real value. As such, and here's the paradox, instead of being free by expanding your choice, instead you become free by narrowing it. So extensively, in fact, that in complete freedom, and this was Augustine's insight in particular, in complete freedom, you basically don't have any choice at all, because there just is no real deliberation to be made. You see the good, you see the light, and so you know what's right for you, and so you just follow it. So, I'd recommend having a go at asking yourself as you go through your daily life whether or not you are really free in the way you go about things. Not to the extent that you can just do what you want in this sort of infantile escape the matrix Andrew Tate nonsense that is basically just like a child playing with as many material toys as he can find. No, that's not freedom at all. It's the opposite. It's stumbling about in the cave blindly, thinking that fancy cars and lots of money will suddenly make you happy, which they won't. Rather, try and discover and uncover your freedom to the extent that you can free yourself from compulsion. Don't think that the addiction model is just for people who are actually addicts, although most of us are actually addicts on our phones nowadays, so there's something you can work on, certainly. Look to become, as the Bhagavad Gita says, free from desire. No longer pushed onward by the impetus of the market saying you have to get this and you have to buy this and you have to get that. Don't just think whatever I want. Think what's good for me. That's where freedom lies. In that sober, rational clarity, in that ability to know what is right and to move toward the good in all things. No longer stumbling about in the dark, knocking into rocks and falling over and grazing your knee this way, that way, because you think that if you just run frantically in any direction, that you'll be fulfilled, that you'll find the light. You won't. Instead, take your time to find the light first and then follow that. With patient and concerted effort, look not for simply the expansion of your choice, but for the light of the good within those choices. Follow that light and let it grow in your vision to a point where you can see little else. Thank you for watching. My Substack is in the description. Have a read, see what you think, let me know what you think, and let me know if you have any video requests as well. Very happy to see you, albeit through the screen, and I will see you next week. Take care.